Food revolutions are those moments in history when changing the way we ate changed us forever. For those who haven't yet watched my previous videos on this, the first revolution was when we invented the knife, which enabled us to get more fat in our diets, which helped us grow bigger brains, which made us smart enough to control fire, which allowed us to cook and eat together, which led to the second and possibly most important turning point in the human story, and in my opinion, the most uniquely human advent of all time, the arrival of storytelling. Then, just a few short million or so years later, we learned how to plant our own food, which allowed us to stay in one place and build cities and invent civilization, so that agriculture became the third great food revolution. The fourth food revolution was the development of fermenting, and even though it had actually been around for billions of years, we changed our world when we learned to harness its power because it enabled us to do long-distance travel, trade, imperialism for better or worse, and may have even played a major role in the development of some of our spiritual paradigms. The fifth food revolution was the Columbian Exchange, when people started sailing their ships between the eastern and western hemispheres, which led to absolute gobs of unintended consequences, including everything from the introduction of tomatoes to Italy and the first earthworms in North America, to minor details like the invention of chemical fertilizer and the emergence of global trade. Okay, so now you're all caught up and ready to hear about the sixth great food revolution, which is, drumroll please. Oh my God, that is an anemic drumroll, but whatever. Introducing the sixth great food revolution, the most important event in recorded human history. The revolution that's already been called a revolution, the Industrial Revolution. But what's that you say? How can I call this a food revolution when it's already been named the Industrial Revolution? Well, sometimes things are just not that tidy. History is complicated. Truth is complicated. We're complicated. You're complicated. I'm complicated. And why is that? Well, it's complicated. And speaking of complicated, the Industrial Revolution is complicated. Some people say it's the only truly important event in human history and that even the Agricultural Revolution wasn't really all that important. On the other hand, some say it's an almost non-event and that we shouldn't even use that term in the first place. Some say that there were several industrial revolutions and that we're just living in the most recent one right now, or that we're right at the dawn of the next one. Now, as for me, I've been looking forward to this topic as much as I've been dreading it at the same time, but it is such an integral part of our food story that it absolutely needs to be told, and someone needs to tell the story of how the Industrial Revolution changed our food and how our food impacted the Industrial Revolution, because that's what started the whole mess we have now. You see, the Industrial Revolution was only made possible in the first place because of how we made our food. We changed the food, and then the food changed us, and that has been the point of this whole story all along, isn't it? And because of that, the story I'm about to tell you is not intended to be a comprehensive and exhaustive history. I'm here to talk about the food during a period of our history that is so deep and complex and even controversial that there's really no way I could do it justice, so no matter what I do, there will be some things I get wrong, if nothing else, simply because there really is no way to get it right because there are so many disagreements among the historians and scholars out there. Luckily for me, I'm not a historian and I'm not a scholar, so I have the luxury of speaking in broad, simplistic generalizations, so for my purposes, I'm just going to say that the period goes from somewhere in the mid-1700s into the 20th century, and for those of you who would argue that it never really ended and that we're still living in it today, I would say, good for you. You're awesome. But as for exactly what it is or was, people argue about that too. I'm going to say that it's what happened when human and animal labor was largely replaced or augmented with machines on a widespread level, and that the stratum of people who had always worked the land as peasants now moved to the cities to become factory workers. Now, as you can guess, not everybody will agree with that definition, but as an unapologetic generalization, we all know what happened. An even simpler way to put it is that we started using machines and human life would never be the same. For most people, life in 1701 was mostly the same as it had been for centuries. Everything they owned, they either had made themselves or had been made by someone they knew. Everything they ate was something that they or someone they knew had harvested. If you could transport one of them back 1,000 years, back to like 700 AD, they would basically know what was going on and they'd have very little problem getting along. I mean, so long as they were able to process the whole time travel thing, but it's just a hypothetical, and I mean, you know what I mean. But transport them forward just 200 years to 1901, and they would be completely confused and frightened by the world. Add just another 50 years or more, and they would simply not be able to function, and they might even lose their literal mind. If you yourself were transported back just 200 years, you would have a really hard time understanding the world. I'm sure I hardly have to point out that change is happening faster and faster and faster. Even the science fiction of my childhood is quaint now. A lot of the fantasy technology of the old Star Trek shows, for instance, has already been eclipsed by real life. Mr. Spock would be utterly bewildered by a smartphone, or the mystery of a quantum computer that bases its calculations on this and that, plus this or that, plus neither this nor that, as all being simultaneously and equally valid and correct. So on that note, let's think of the Industrial Revolution in those terms. It didn't really happen, yet we all know it did. Nobody can really define it, but we all just sort of know what it was, or is, or whatever. But what does that have to do with food? Well, nothing except absolutely everything. In a way, it all started with food. You see, the Industrial Revolution couldn't have happened unless you had people to work in those factories and a way to keep them fed. Enter the Agrarian Revolution, which some could argue I should have done a whole video on that one alone, to which I would say, feel free to make your own channel. And since I'm not going to do a whole video on that subject, I'll reduce that entire story down to 3 things. Firstly, there were new farming technologies like the seed drill, which increased the amount of food that could be raised on a piece of land. Transportation was improved with new roads and modes of river travel that allowed the new food supply to be delivered to the cities. The fields were also reorganized by what's called the enclosure system, which increased efficiency, resulting in more total output, while also consolidating smaller farms into bigger farms. Now, even though that resulted in more net food, it also had the side effect of putting a lot of the small farmers out of work, which meant they had to find new means of living. And for many, if not most, that meant moving to the city and getting one of those new factory jobs. So those changes in concert took care of the need for laborers while also helping raise the food to feed them, and also provided a way to deliver the food to the new workforce. So the Industrial Revolution would not have been possible in the first place except for changes in the food system. So once again, changing the way we ate changed us forever, just like I promised. But wait, there's more. Another thing historians love to argue about is as to which of the new technologies launched the actual Industrial Revolution. Some say it was new inventions in the textile industry like the flying shuttle or mechanized looms. Others say that it really was the invention of the steam engine. Now, I'll leave it to the historians to argue about that, and while they're at it, they can argue about who actually invented the steam machine. Yeah, it's another controversy, but whichever name you put on it, whether it be Thomas Newcomen, Roisin Murphy, Thomas Savery, or even James Watt, one of those stories says that he, whoever he was, he got the idea while watching a tea kettle because when the water started boiling, it made the lid rattle as the expanding steam needed a way to escape, and he thought, wow, if a little water could move that lid, I wonder if a lot of water could move a big old piston. And with that, the steam engine was born, and the world would never be the same. It's not completely clear if that's a true story, but I like believing that it is, because if so, once again, the whole thing started in the kitchen. We changed the way we boiled water, and boiling water changed us, and that fits my tidy little paradigm perfectly, so let's just go with it. And just to put a point on how important that invention was, if you think about it, that is still the basic technology that drives most of our current world. Electricity made from coal, gas, or nuclear is still made by heating up a liquid and using the steam to move a wheel. Our cars still use pistons driven by expanding gas. That old invention is still with us, and it's still doing most of the work. Crazy, man. But that was just the beginning. Replacing manual tasks with steam-powered machines changed how everything was done. Not only could we make more things, but we could now invent things that couldn't have been made before. We invented new things that enabled us to invent other new things that enabled us to make more new things to invent. So we not only had these new inventions, we had lots of them. Now, of course, seemingly overnight, every type of production of every kind of thing skyrocketed, while invention fueled even more invention. So bit by bit, in industry by industry, the steam engine and newfangled contraptions worked their way into literally every sector of the economy, from transportation to, you guessed it, food production. Now, one very telling example is that flour mills, up until that point, had mostly been local operations. Every community had one, and they were mostly driven by water wheels. All the nearby farmers would come to the mill with their grain and have it ground. The miller would take a share of the flour in exchange, and that's how it worked for centuries. There was no such thing as stone ground flour because all flour was stone ground. But then the Industrial Revolution came and revolutionized that industry. First thing was that the water wheels were replaced by steam engines, which meant that you could now build a mill anywhere. You didn't need a water wheel, so you didn't need to be near a river. You also didn't need a stone grinding wheel that wore down more quickly when driven by a machine. Thanks again to new technology, stone grinding wheels were replaced by steel rollers, and that change changed everything. It's been said, in fact, that the dawn of industrial food actually was the advent of mills that use steel rollers instead of stones to grind flour. Steel rollers resulted in a white, nutrient-sparse flour with a longer shelf life. White flour was probably the first industrialized processed food, and the first time that our senses led us away from nutrition, since this type of milling removed the germ and the fiber. It left us with just the endosperm, which was less nutrition, but people really liked it, and the public began wanting ever whiter flour. So the public actually wanted the less nutritious choice. I mean, can you imagine that? The public actually wanting something that isn't in their best interest? Inconceivable! People's taste for white flour even led to some manufacturers adulterating their flour with chalk or alum or bleaching it with carcinogenic bromates, so this reflected the way people began to see food as a profit center as opposed to sustenance for loved ones. Another casualty in the advent of steel mills was the extinction of those small, local mills. People used to know their millers, who were highly regarded members of the community. Millers were pillars. There were even laws in some places prohibiting the export of flour to prevent dishonorable millers from selling to foreign markets willing to pay a higher price while their own neighbors went hungry, but that's a whole other story. Mills used to serve their community, making healthy flour, and they were tied to the land since they relied on water or the tides or the wind to operate. When the Industrial Revolution brought steel rollers powered by steam engines, this changed. And when people started using those steam engines to power trains, growers could now use mills miles and miles away from their farm, while the mills could more easily sell flour miles and miles away from their facility, thus increasing even more of the anonymity between producer and consumer. Food was now commonly being produced for no other purpose other than profit. Food was also becoming less meaningful, while our lives were becoming less meaningful, while the lives of the consumer was becoming less meaningful, to the point where the consumer actually preferred the ever more nutrient-sparse versions of what used to be food. And here was an unintended side effect. Whereas insect infestation had been a problem for millers for centuries, the flour produced by steel rollers didn't have this problem because the white flour didn't have enough nutrients to support the pests. Right. Even the bugs didn't want anything to do with the stuff. Now, of course, around the 1940s, mills started enriching their flour with vitamins, but how is that better? Removing the nutrients up to a point where not even insects want it and then loading it up with synthetic vitamins to make up for it? It's nothing if not telling. Now, this transition didn't happen everywhere and it didn't happen all at once, but it did also mark the beginning of a really important trend. This was the beginning of the shift of our diets away from produce and toward grain. Fewer cabbages and more bread. Fewer vitamins and higher blood sugar. Less fiber and more inflammation. More neighbors and fewer friends. More minutes and fewer moments. Less meaning and more meanness. This reduction in nutrients and food resulted in an uptick in diet-related diseases like rickets and scurvy. So, in short, more food and less nutrition. Nonetheless, for all the criticism, and there is plenty to go around, lifespans increased. So once again, just like has happened in the agricultural revolution, people began to live longer but less interesting lives. The advent of steam-powered machines led to more production. Then the construction of the rail network led to better distribution of food. Both resulted in a reduction in hunger and both accelerated in people a sense of anonymity and alienation. One gave us food produced by people we'd never met, while the other gave us food produced in places we'd never heard of. But that was just the beginning, and as you can see, it's already untidy. Time is a spindly thing with tentacles that meander and tangle and muss up your hair and make you get all mussed up. Time is mussy stuff. And while all this roller stuff was rolling along in the fields and the mills, a whole other story was spindling along in the cities. As people were getting pushed off the farms and into the cities, life was turning to something almost weird. Now, before we over-romanticize the old agrarian ways, it's important to keep in mind that because of the Industrial Revolution, people were living longer and the population boomed. There was less hunger. And if you've studied economics, then this was the moment when humanity escaped the Malthusian trap. There was more exchange of ideas and culture between people of different backgrounds. And before this time, most working people had been peasants. There were cities with merchants and shops, to be sure, but around 90% of people worked as farmers on land that was owned by the local nobility. They had no chance of ever changing the course of the lives that they were born into, and those lives were at the same time very servile, but also somewhat slower paced and less stressful in a way. The peasants on a particular plot of land collectively grew food on that land. Some of that food went to the nobility, some went into their own bellies, and some went to the market. But when factories came on the scene, the landowners saw that they could make oodles of boodles more money by operating a factory than they ever could by having peasants on the land. This is important because almost instantly, humans had jobs. They also had new problems. There was more crime, more squalor. Denser populations propelled the spread of some diseases. There was more water available, but people dumped their sewage in the streets and in the rivers directly upstream from the next users. There were severe housing shortages, resulting in at times as many as a dozen or more people living in a single room. The population boomed, and as a matter of supply and demand, a larger population meant a surplus in workers, which caused wages to plummet. And workers were forced to work long hours in brutal and dangerous conditions because workers needed jobs just as the factories needed workers, and that created a sort of a permanent working class. The only way for most ordinary people in a city to survive at all was to work at a job, and those jobs were often back-breaking, cruel affairs that just barely covered the cost of living, if even that. Hours were long, workplace injuries and deaths were rampant, debt bondage was commonplace. Being a worker in the industrial age was a brutal, meaningless, and bleak life, yet by all conventional measures, life was getting better. 100 years earlier, you were growing peas. Now you were working to exhaustion in a facility that processed the peas and canned the peas and got the peas ready to go out in the market. And when you finally got home, you were hungry and you looked on the shelf and lo and behold, for supper, a can of peas. Oh, the ironing. Yes, but that was part of the reality of having a job, and this was the beginning of the 3-meal-per-day model that we think of now. You ate something before you went to work in the morning, you ate something in the middle of your workday, and you ate something when you got home at night. That's pretty much the advent of breakfast, lunch, and dinner as we now know it, but there were a couple new challenges with this. For one, you had less time to cook food and no place to grow it. For two, you needed a way to bring your lunch to the factory without it going bad. But now, thanks to pre-packaged prepared foods, factory workers had a way of bringing food to their jobs and eating this new thing called lunch. And at home, they could stock up on even more canned foods that they could open up and eat in the precious little time that they had before getting up the next morning to start the whole routine over again. And this was only possible because of the advent of mass-produced food, what people in the food industry now call CPGs, or consumer packaged goods. Canned foods could be packed very uniformly. They could be made very uniformly, which made them taste very uniformly, and like it or not, mass-produced food changed everything about us. That was yet another moment where changing the way we ate changed who we were at a fundamental level forever. So much so that it is going to get its own video a little later. In the millions of years before this, food had been the central focus of almost every day for most people. The acquisition and preparation of food, our most primordial physiological function and our most essential need, had been performed and experienced with our families, our clans, our tribes, and our villages, and so was the primary glue of the fabric of society. Now every step of the process from the seed to the plate was done in anonymity. Back in the village, I had a vested interest in making sure that you had safe, healthy food because, for one, I probably cared about you as a person, and for two, our village benefited from your labor. We needed each other to be healthy, functioning members of our little society. Everybody was needed, and every loss was felt by everyone. Post-industrialization, however, food was no longer the focus of a day's energy, and it has required less and less of our personal resources and energy with every generation. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not being required to devote my whole day's energy into staying alive frees me to make art, ponder life's mysteries, entertain myself, or help others. But now, if I'm working in a cannery processing and packaging peas, I have no idea who's going to eat them. I might care about them in some kind of abstract or altruistic way, but it's not the same as how I might feel about my child, or my niece, or my neighbor, or even my neighbor's niece's child. The person who eats these peas will probably never consider me, much less thank me, and we're certainly never going to go hunting together or planting together. I could die tomorrow and they would never know or notice or care so long as they can still get the next can of peas. Now, that doesn't make us bad. It's just the reality of the industrial food chain. Joel Salatin once said that the food industry sees livestock as mechanical, not biological. I 100% agree with that, and I would even expand that to all food, not just animals. The food industry sees the entire process from planting to vending as a machine, not the source of life. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, this paradigm was brand new. Never before in our 300,000 years as a species had anyone seen or experienced food this way. What had always been the matrix of all our relationships was now just a number on a ledger. Whereas our objective had always been the health of all the people in the world whom we love, our objective now was just money, no matter how little or how much. And it was the case for both the producer and the eater. And as our view of food changed, so did our view of each other. Even the most enlightened among us in the modern world can't help but think of the food production system as a sort of machine, which means we started thinking of each other as parts of a machine. Food was now just a detail that needed to be considered to keep industry running. Almost instantaneously, it became true that industrial food primarily feeds industry. Industrial food primarily feeds industry. Surprise, surprise. You may recall that I said that the agricultural revolution resulted in people working longer hours for less nutritious food while leading less interesting lives. Well, the Industrial Revolution was that same phenomenon times 10. Plus, the food now was made by people who didn't know where it was going for people who didn't know where it was from. Almost complete anonymity. And anonymity breeds apathy. Not only were the mills cutting the flour with toxic fillers, some pickle manufacturers added copper to their pickles to make them more green. The list of harmful additives goes on and on and on, and finally in 1820, a book was published by one Friedrich Achem called Death in a Pot, a treatise on the adulteration of food and culinary poisons, that called out so many of these types of practices so as to eventually lead to the first laws designed to protect food safety. The point is that working people at this time are now no longer raising food, they're working in factories. Some of those factories are producing food-like substances that are nutritionally compromised and made by design to create profit, not health. This is the moment when we became divested from our food. By the time I was born, industrial food like that can of peas was the norm, and it was fresh food that had become the novelty. That humble can of peas tells the whole story, though. From the seed drill that planted the pea, to the machines that brought the pea to the cannery, to the machines that cooked the pea and put the pea in a can and printed a label for the can and then carried the pea to the store, to the cash register that rang up the pea, to the machine that built the can opener, to the stove that heated up the pea, and the machine that built the pot, and the machine that provided a job for the person who ate the pea so that they could take the train to their job, to the mint that coined the currency that he was paid in, to the whistles and bells and time clocks that bounded the days, to the textile mills that made the cloth that bounded his pants, to the wrought iron boundaries for the cemetery where he was finally laid to rest. This was the very sudden, very drastic, and highly dramatic birth of the modern world that we would basically recognize and understand as ours, where industrial food is the norm and fresh food grown by someone you know is the novelty. For most modern people, the very notion of living in accord with the rhythms of nature is novel, so much so that we spend thousands of dollars on vacations to places where we can get just the smallest slice of life in the natural world. It's nice, but it's ephemeral and incomplete. The food we eat on vacation is still probably produced by people who don't know where it's going and eaten by people who don't know where it's from. We know more about the trees we're admiring than we know about the person who made our freeze-dried camping food. Now, don't get me wrong here, I'm not necessarily a critic. Industrial food also meant less scarcity and less hunger. During the 20th century, the global population increased fourfold, while food consumption per capita increased 20-fold. What's more interesting to me is how this happened. And like everything else in the human story, it wasn't one single thing. We had new agricultural practices which gave us more productive crops that required less time, less labor, and fewer inputs. We had new technologies that could make every step of the entire process more efficient. We had the advent of specialization, which increased output everywhere from the farm to the factory. All of this abundance led to a population boom, resulting in a larger labor pool willing to work for sub-poverty wages. And one unanticipated outcome of industrialization is that it was now possible for a person, if they were extremely lucky, to amass wealth regardless of their birthright. A person with the right combination of hard work, cleverness, cunning, and sheer luck could actually become wealthy. A fair number of the American robber barons came from meager origins, whereas in the old feudal system, the only people with means and money were clergy and the nobility, and no amount of hard work, cleverness, cunning, or luck could possibly change that. But now you could become a clerk or a manager or a teacher or a trader and get a little ahead. Obviously, only a very, 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 very teeny, teensy, tiny fraction of a few of the people who got a little ahead became gazillionaires, but a lot of those who rose out of poverty ended up somewhere in the middle, and thus was born, you guessed it, the middle class. And it wouldn't have never happened except that someone was paying attention when they boiled some water once. It's been said that civilization is simply the outcome of organizing food, and I think that's true. It certainly ushered in the Anthropocene and set the stage for what was to come next. And what's that, you might ask? Well, make sure to like and subscribe so that I can keep the channel going, and while you're at it, hit the bell so that you get notified when I make the next fascinating video about that next big coming thing. But for now, it is time for me to wrap up this video. Thanks again so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Ciao.